Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is episode 79 of season 2. The last few episodes have all been consumed by the spectre of Talikota looming large in the history of the Deccan. For good reason, because so many things changed. And to get a grip on where things stood, it's sometimes necessary to look at events that occurred in the aftermath. This is because while Vijayanagara may have been sacked, the empire of Vijayanagara did not vanish. But it did lose its center of gravity. The Aravidu rulers continued the empire. They were the new royalty, the fourth dynasty of Vijayanagara. But as we saw in the last episode, their authority was no longer binding. And we saw that Bangalore did not join the drift of people leaving the fold. Kempe Gowda did not declare independence. He remained where he was, even if it was within a structure that was weakening around him. This episode is about what that choice meant in the final years of Kempe Gowda's life. Before anything though, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group. This podcast is possible because of their support. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of that future. Simply add prestige to your life. When empires weaken, the men at the edges feel it first. Men like Kempe Gowda I, for whom the moment carried a strange duality. On the one hand, the disappearance of effective imperial supervision created space for him. Decisions could be taken locally without waiting for royal sanction. Revenues collected in the territory could be retained at his will without the same pressure of remittance. Only a request and an appeal to his loyalty could work. In purely administrative terms, his autonomy was everything. On the other hand, the absence of an overlord strips away protection. Without an empire, there's no higher authority to appeal to in case of encroachment, no guarantor of tenure, no final arbiter if stronger neighbors tested boundaries. The only thing that was possible in those conditions was an all-out fight, and not everyone wanted to, even if they were capable. Autonomy in these conditions was no longer a privilege that was granted by some sort of royal or imperial order. It was just being exposed to the wild. Kempe Gowda did not respond to this altered world and altered circumstances by being opportunistic and claiming kingship. He didn't want royal titles. He did not rebrand himself as sovereign. He continued to speak the language of loyalty to Vijayanagara, even as the empire itself has just become diminished. A poor framework of its former self. This was not sentimentality on the part of Kempe Gowda. It was good calculation. The legitimacy of the Alahanka lineage had always rested on its recognized place within an imperial order. However hollow that imperial order may have become after 1565, it still remained the grammar through which authority was articulated. To step outside that grammar was to risk becoming just another local strongman in a landscape that was quickly filling up with them. The fall of Vijayanagara came only a year after Kempe Gowda's release from imprisonment at Anegundi in 1564. His imprisonment had been a constant reminder that any local power only operated in the shadow of imperial suspicion. So he returned to Bangalore, older, chastened, and acutely aware of the fragility of one's position. The city that he had founded in 1537, Bangalore, was no longer an experiment. It was productive, visible, and therefore vulnerable. Between 1565 and roughly 1569, his final years traditionally attributed to his life, Kempe Gowda continued to function as a working Paligar or an Prabhu. He did not retreat into obscurity. He didn't display any appetite for expansion beyond his means. What marked this period was not grand ambition, but a consolidation of what he had built. The clearest example of Kempe Gowda wanting to consolidate everything that he had built was Shivaganga. Now, Kempe Gowda's involvement with Shivaganga predated Talikota by several years. Even around 1550, he is reported to have annexed that region. This followed the establishment of the Bangalore Pete and came likely after he had secured control over the 10 hublis that traditionally associated with his early authority that were granted to him ostensibly by Achyutaraya. Shivaganga was situated on a prominent hill right to the northwest of Bangalore, and that is not an incidental acquisition. Shivaganga Hill commanded approaches to the plateau, and it offered both defensive elevation as well as a symbolic presence. Various accounts suggest that his engagement with Shivaganga began with some intermittent pressure. He did raids, he had some assertions of influence, even before he had formally incorporated Shivaganga into his Nadu. By the middle of the 16th century, Shivaganga's annexation was no longer exploratory. It represented the integration of a strategic, significant hill principality into his territorial system. And there is material evidence at Shivaganga to prove this. At the hill temple of Gangadhareshwara stands a bronze image, and the locals say it is Kempe Gowda I. Inscriptions connected to the site credit him with renovating the temple complex. Now, historians don't necessarily dispute this. Kempe Gowda is also said to have constructed a large audience hall on the hill. It is locally remembered as Kempe Gowda's Hazara. He built stone steps that made previously inaccessible caverns reachable for pilgrims. Shivaganga is important. It was a stronghold for his treasury, a sort of high-altitude vault. Now, whether or not the entirety of the state wealth was stored there or not, the logic is unmistakable and routine. A fortified hill, elevated and defensible, doubled as a lookout and as a vault for the treasury. For Kempe Gowda in the years after 1565, consolidation of his land was the key. And the absence of strong, decisive rulers, kings like Krishnadeva or Achyutaraya being good reason for him to secure his existing possessions. Now it stands to reason that without that imperial shield, each acquisition that he would have made carried a risk. Expansion in a time of such political looseness was not a display of confidence, it was actually an added burden. So therefore the Shivaganga hill fort was different. It was a strong defensive move. Now an inscription from Malur gives us even more context. It records a land grant made by Hiriya Kempe Gowda to a deity. Significantly, the inscription includes a dedication to Tirumala Devaraya seated on the throne at Chandragiri. So we know by this that the Vijayanagara capital had shifted from Penukonda to Chandragiri, and we know that Kempe Gowda had continued his vassalage to the Rayas. Under earlier stronger imperial conditions, annexation of Shivaganga would have been accompanied by some sort of explicit recognition and reward. In the post-1565 environment, such recognition was likely much thinner, and yet the gesture of dedication still remained to the Aravidu dynasty. So, the Palegar operated independently in practice, but not in language. The balance of autonomy in action, but loyalty in dedicating everything to the king characterizes Kempe Gowda's final years. But overall, the inscriptional trail itself begins to thin in the later years. It tapered off, and so did Kempe Gowda himself. He is said to have died around 1569. Now this is an assumption derived from connecting dots wherever information has been available. The end of Kempe Gowda's life is not marked by some kind of grand court chronicle or an official obituary. He was not a king. Palegars and Nadaprabhus did not leave the same documentary footprints as emperors. Their lives were not chronicled in the same way that royals and Nayakas were. But we have enough for there not to be a void, because Kempe Gowda had combined multiple roles in his lifetime: founder, administrator, military organizer, and intermediary between local society and the imperial structure of Vijayanagara. Now these roles were tightly bound to his person and his persona. Now, the consolidation of Shivaganga, the maintenance of tanks, the renovations of temples, all of these things point to a man who realized that what he wanted to do was to consolidate his domain in a period of uncertainty. But even as he stabilized this terrain, the larger political order continued to loosen. By the end of the 1560s, the world in which Kempe Gowda had risen was no longer intact. The empire that had authorized his early expansion and had blessed him with patronage was now nothing but a ceremonial shadow. Provincial governors like the Mahamandaleshwaras and administrative networks that once ordered orderly reporting and recognition were disrupted. Record keeping itself became uneven. In such conditions, the final years of Kempe Gowda were not accompanied by spectacle. What we see, instead of grand gestures and grand projects, was day-to-day management. Inscriptions or records that spoke about things like religious endowments or architectural repair work, all with the continued use of imperial dedication of the grants. They were all anchors, his legitimacy for the coming centuries. While opportunists would have declared independence, refused a token empire like the Aravidus their share of income, and usurped land that rightfully belonged to Vijayanagara, Kempe Gowda did not step into kingship when the opportunity presented itself. He stepped instead deeper and deeper into day-to-day administration. And then somewhere around 1569, the records begin to fall silent. It's time now for a commercial break, and when I return, we will confront that silence directly. The problems of fixing the date of his death, the ambiguity of the evidence, and what it means when a founder like Kempe Gowda disappears just as the old order dissolves. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Before the break, I talked about how Kempe Gowda wanted to consolidate what he had built. But now let's talk about what happened after his death and why there's such a lot of confusion about it. As I mentioned before, Kempe Gowda does not leave behind the sort of historical record about his death in the way that royalty gets. There's no court chronicles or imperial decrees or carefully staged funerals. The authority of the Nada Prabhu was local, and any history about him necessarily came from stray written records and more often from oral histories, and oral histories are notoriously hard to rely on. Until very recently, for example, it was settled history that Kempe Gowda had died in 1569, maybe 1570, and this has been the accepted endpoint of his life. This has been repeated in official documents as though it was corroborated by inscriptional evidence, but it was not. When you try to follow the trail, it becomes clear that 1569 was a date that everyone agreed to repeat. There are no stone inscriptions or copperplate inscriptions or chronicles of any sort, and there are no charters that record the succession by Kempe Gowda II or even by a person called Gidde Gowda between Kempe Gowda I and II. So we know that there was a succession. And there was always evidence of a Hiriya Kempe Gowda, so we know that was the case. But there was no set dates. Now this is not unusual in the sort of regional historiography that one has to get accustomed to. Dates often stabilize not because they are definitely proven, but because they are convenient reference points. And once said, those dates travel. Once cited and once repeated sufficiently, they acquire authority, they become the truth. So what we have as 1569 as the year of Kempe Gowda's death, therefore, is not a verified death year, but a conventional one. But in the larger narrative, sometimes that's good enough, because nothing significant happened to make that date a point of contention. But if you stop to think about it, there is a need to reach some kind of precision for its own sake, and not fall to the sort of vagueness and imprecision of record keeping which has unfortunately plagued Indian history since the beginning. The danger of the absence of historical record keeping leads to people filling the void with assumptions or stories, sometimes totally made up narratives that suits whatever purpose, political for example. So in Kempe Gowda's case, the tidy narrative was that he died peacefully and uneventfully after a long and distinguished life. It suited the image of an aging founder closing his career with nothing much to say. The long and distinguished life part we all know about. How he died, we don't. And that is why the narrative shifted in 2015. In the village of Kempapura, which is on the western end of Bangalore, somewhere near Makali, a structure long obscured by weeds and overgrowth drew attention when a college student Prashant Marur, noticed its Gopura-like form resembled the Kempe Gowda pillars in Bengaluru. So he stopped, cleared the bramble, and he uncovered what was soon identified as a mausoleum associated with Hiriya Kempe Gowda. The structure, which was clearly either a mausoleum or a monument to memory, bears an inscription. It was written in the Kannada of the day, and it read, Hiriya Kempe Gowda I Kunigalinda Bandu Ee Baliya Jagalavannu Madi Aikiya Kailasike Podasthala. It is archaic language, but it's not hard to figure out. This is the translation. This is the site where Kempe Gowda I, having come from Kunigal and after engaging in a battle here, became united with Kailasa. United with Kailasa means he died. Once Marur's discovery was reported to the government, they at once set up a commission. Historians visited the site. The structure was authenticated. A report was submitted to the Bangalore municipal authorities by Dr. Sheikh Mastan of the Bangalore University. The site is now accepted as the place where Kempe Gowda died. Maybe even the place where he was buried. We don't know fully. I did speak with Dr. Mastan and had a wonderful conversation with him. Now, not every other historian was accepting of this report. Some historians said that there's still a lot of room for doubt and interpretation. One of them even mentioned that this monument might have been a dedication to an unrelated Kempe Gowda from the local village. But we can safely conclude that a local farmer from the area would not have received the honor of such a large and expensive monument to memory, one that looked exactly like the Kempe Gowda Gopuras. Either way, the monument complicates the chronology. The question is whether Kempe Gowda actually died in 1569 or if he died a few years later, 5 years later, even more, some said. And any records that suggest that he was no longer Nada Prabhu after 1569 might have been because stepping down was part of the terms of his release from the prison at Anegundi. In other words, some scholars even suggested that Kempe Gowda may have lived longer than previously believed, maybe well into the early years of the 17th century. And if that was so, 1569 might not mark his death. It might mark his withdrawal from active rule, a sort of abdication if you like. So anyway, at present there is no definitive resolution. The inscriptions don't provide a firm date. So the earlier tradition of 1569 now lacks epigraphical confirmation, and what remains is a field of plausible interpretations rather than any settled fact. And then for some historians, there's another complication that deepens the uncertainty, and this goes to the business of whether or not he lived into the early years of the next century. At Shivaganga, the bronze image that is identified at Kempe Gowda bears an inscription which was dated 1608. It describes Kempe Gowda, son of Kempanacharya Gowda of Bengaluru, always making obeisance at the feet of Lord Gangadhareshwara. Now, that date, 1608, is very clear in that inscription. So if the traditional year of death is 1569, if that was firm, then in this inscription would have to be a commemorative one, executed 4 decades after his passing. It's possible, but it's not that simple. Because by 1608, the Yelahanka lineage was firmly into its next generation. Now, some epigraphical records show that there was a Gidde Gowda who succeeded Kempe Gowda I around 1570, and then he was followed by Kempe Gowda II, who assumed authority by 1585. The genealogical chain continues steadily through the 17th century. That means, by the time the 1608 bronze was installed, the family was not in confusion. It was stable enough to curate memory correctly. Now, I know this is like a ball of wool tangled, but it raises a subtle question. When the Malur inscription refers to Hiriya Kempe Gowda making a grant under Tirumala Devaraya at Chandragiri, is it speaking of a living authority at the moment? Or is it just invoking the name as an ancestral source? Or was this inscription simply recording an event that happened many years into the past? Nothing seems likely. What we know is that the word Hiriya means elder, in other words, the first. It distinguishes him from an Immadi, which is the second Kempe Gowda. But it does nothing to fix the date of his death. If Kempe Gowda died in 1569, then the 1608 bronze represents some sort of retrospective sanctification, a grandson or a great-grandson paying obeisance. But if he didn't die in 1569 and lived longer, perhaps stepping aside while remaining alive, then the neat chronology of 1569 repeated often becomes unstable. Neither possibility can be dismissed. What becomes clear is that by the early 17th century, Kempe Gowda, the founder, was already being framed in devotional memory. His authority was no longer administrative, it was ancestral. And that shift matters. Now, it matters because it suggests that even as political power in the region was becoming more contested, the Yelahanka lineage strengthened itself, not by claiming kingship, but by stabilizing its narrative continuity. Maybe this is how they handled the absence of royalty, by presuming a presence of one. And all this brings us back to the political meaning of Kempe Gowda's death. When he died in 1569 or whenever it was, whether he fell in armed confrontation somewhere between Kunigal and Kempapura and passed quietly, so whether the Kempapura structures marks the precise spot of his death or only commemorates it symbolically, the structural consequence is quite clear. The heft of Kempe Gowda's authority did not survive him in the form that he had exercised it. His successors inherited the forts, the markets, the tanks, the temple networks, hill vault at Shivaganga. They inherited the geometry of the Bengaluru Pete. Kempe Gowda II, for example, is credited with having set up the watchtowers that we see around Bengaluru today. All that is true, but the successors did not inherit the kind of authority that Kempe Gowda had. That is what I meant by asymmetry, and that is what I meant by the duality. A durable city, but a fragile authority. And that was the central inheritance of Kempe Gowda's life and death. It influenced all the decades that followed. His successors no longer possessed the singular presence of Kempe Gowda, backed by a strong royalty. Kempe Gowda disappears from view just as the old order dissolves and before a new one took shape. And the city remains. The certainty of it did not. In the next episode, we turn to the successors and to what would be remembered as the golden years of the Kempe Gowdas. That's coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.